maybe it's coincidence, but
Tell me about that later on. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Wilson Center. Welcome to this event with the Mexico Institute. We are extraordinarily happy to be able to present another book by Luis Rubio, but not just another book by Luis Rubio. Luis and I got to know each other about 4 years ago over gin and tonics at a hotel here in Washington. And shortly after that, Luis came to the Wilson Center to spend a few months as a research fellow here. And in typical Luis style, he had proposed a project which he completed before he arrived. So we said, all right, we better think of what you're going to do. And obviously, you know, the question of rule of law, the political system in Mexico is always an important topic. And so Luis said, I have a mischievous idea, I think was how you put it. And he said, I've got this title, A Mexican Utopia, which is clearly tongue-in-cheek. But he's subtitled it, The Rule of Law is Possible. And once he had written that book and I'd read it, I realized that this was just the beginning of a conversation. And thinking that the Wilson Center is the institution par excellence for having conversations and dialogue, I said to Luis, well, you know, have you got another idea that we could sort of build on this one? So he came up with the problem of power, which really focused on the failings of the Mexican political system. And then we thought, well, if you've got two books, you may as well complete the trilogy. And so we have A World of Opportunities by Luis Rubio now, which is an absolutely cracking read. Always in Luis's work, I find myself at some point in the narrative stopping and laughing to myself because he said something that rings so true in your head that you say, oh gosh, yeah, I kind of knew that, but I'd never thought about it in those terms before. Or it was that light bulb going off above your head where you say, oh, that's why things are the way they are. And for me, it was the revelation that Luis makes, where he talks about the fact that in Mexico, there was a process of democratization, but really it was about power sharing more than democratization. These books, which hold together wonderfully as a trilogy, are an incredible contribution to our understanding of politics and governability in Mexico. But they also contain not just the seed, but the seedlings of hope for reform in Mexico. I urge you to read them. We decided in this one to be a little bit mischievous in some of the images that we put in here, particularly in the placement of those images. I'll let you decide what you think about that. But I can tell by Luis's face that he kind of approves. Before I turn the microphone over to Luis, because this is his show and I want him to run it, I would like to thank our three panelists. This really is a panel de lujo here this afternoon. We have two board members, Rosana Fuentes and Carlos Heredia, who are dear friends of the Mexico Institute. Thank you very much for being here and offering your comments. And of course, Andrew Selee, formerly of the Wilson Center. Yes, the artist formerly known as Andrew Selee of the Wilson Center. Formerly executive vice president here, but also, of course, the founding director of the Mexico Institute and are you present or future president of MPI, of Migration Policy Institute? And Andrew, it's great to have you back here. I said this at the dinner last night. It's brilliant that we will continue to hang out and work together. So thanks very much for being here. Yes, we will. All right, without any further ado, I will turn the microphone over to Luis. Luis, congratulations on this book. I am enormously grateful for your putting your trust in us to produce your work. And to make sure that it gets out to an audience who will appreciate it. We'll do our very, very best on that. Thank you.
thank you, Duncan, and thank you all for being here. I just want to ask you if your comments about the trilogy mean that that's the end of the road and that there will be no more.
I'm glad you can read between the lines.
Is it Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter?
Maybe I'll start doing some movie work or something. So this is the third book of a trilogy. It's been part of a conversation, as Duncan rightly put it. They have all been aimed at bringing Mexico, all of Mexico, not just parts of Mexico, into the 21st century, and trying to understand myself and communicate my thoughts on what is missing in Mexico to be able to make that big stride that is still missing. I first proposed a way for the government to take the lead, and that's what the book on Utopia attempted. Then I worked on the explanation of why it didn't happen, and that was the structure of power that hinders and makes that impossible or almost impossible. And when that was being discussed exactly a year ago here, Duncan asked the question that I'm trying to reply to in this new book, which is what would it take for change to really take shape in Mexico? So this essay seeks to provide an idea of how change could be forged, starting with society, rather than with expecting that some sudden big figure would be capable or willing to take charge. And that as sort of as last Sunday's election in 4 Mexican states makes clear, it is more compelling today than it ever was. It is either society that will take the lead or nobody else will. So what needs doing is, I don't think, difficult to fathom. And that's not because everything is known or everything has been properly diagnosed in Mexico as the problems that need addressing. Rather, it is because it is not rocket science. It may not be easy to implement what's needed, but what ails Mexico is almost too obvious. It's not I'm not suggesting that there are specific policies or reforms that have to be undertaken, but the issues that have to be addressed are fairly clear. The question is what might provoke the change, the balls to start rolling and to make that process of transformation possible. What will trigger a process that then becomes unstoppable and with popular support? Mexicans have been addressing their problems for many years. If one looks back, it's astounding how much Mexico has actually changed. If one looks forward, it always looks uphill. Yet, the reforms of the 1980s, 90s, and the more recent ones have advanced and have made it possible for many changes to take place, and yet we always end up failing at the last minute of implementation because they are only partly implemented. So many things do happen, many things do advance, but many others don't. And more important, there are huge promises that those reforms will finally settle and resolve whatever the issue is, and they end up being over-promises because the reform itself cannot deliver what it is being promised because it's not being implemented in full. Ultimately, because there are powers that are powerful enough to make it impossible for that implementation to take place or to annul some of key components of that. And that's what ultimately all boils down to. For this process of change to take place, there needs to be those big powers have to be undermined because they are sources of corruption, patronage, rent-seeking, and so on. Be them political, union, business, whatever they've proven to be powerful enough to stave off change in many different places. But what's key is that many of these power structures and the Soviet-style social system that engenders privilege and all over Mexico, all of this is sustained by the old system, which was more unlike the Soviet system in conception than to other countries. And let me say that in different words. Mexico is much less similar to Latin American countries than it is to the Soviet Union. And by that I don't mean in ideological terms, but the system that pre-created was much more alike the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and again, not in ideological terms, but in the structure, in the idea of building a system of beliefs that people could buy into, and therefore they supported and still support the system. Mexicans are not as willing to rebel as other Latin Americans are, simply because that system compelled them not to. This is, of course, something that is going to wash out over the years as demography simply changes reality. But my sense is that part of the power of the teachers' union is precisely that they were in the business of selling ideology, of maintaining and preserving control on the status quo. So the same is true of the more obvious symptoms of trouble that Mexico faces, like corruption, violence, and drugs. I don't believe that those are the issues that have to be attacked. I think that the problem in Mexico is that these are symptoms. The root cause is the absence of government. We have a government that is derived from the 19th century. It is the system that Juárez Porfirio Díaz, built gradually for that era. But even though obviously there has been some evolution, the governmental system at its core remains exactly that, built in that era. So it obviously doesn't match with reality, doesn't match with a country that has overgrown dramatically, that is much more diverse, dispersed, that is very closely tied to the rest of the world in any number of ways. And that's not only true of manufactured exports as NAFTA would have it. It also has to do with, for instance, remittances. We have a rural middle class that Mexico would never have developed without those remittances. There's a large community of people in the rural areas that live much better off than one would imagine. It's not the poorest peasants that we have an idea of. I don't mean that to say that every Mexican peasant is doing well. I'm simply saying that remittances have changed the lives of many communities along the Mexican rural areas. So the point is that the Mexican government that exists as it exists today cannot deal with issues of today, and it doesn't do so well. The issue of security is probably the most obvious one, but it's not the only one. Security used to be maintained by a very powerful central government that controlled everything. But as power decentralized, and that had to do with evolution of society, but also with the defeat of PRI in the elections, because that divorced the PRI and the presidency, and that started the process of decentralization of power that has not been reinstitutionalized. So the governors and other groups in society became very powerful, but didn't use that power to maintain the peace in society. It's interesting that there have been many quick fixes here and there, but some of them simply don't work. And the solutions that Mexico has been seeing in the last few years are very interesting. Let me say something that might sound really excessive, but I don't think it is. We have both a president and the challenger, the main challenger for the election next year, both live in the same era of Mexico, which is the 1970s, 1960s, 1970s. Both represent the old PRI in the way they conceive of the world. They have different policy preferences, as there were different coalitions formed in that era, some more to the right, some more to the left. But the main point is that both conceive the world in very similar terms. One may be more personalities are very different, but both conceive the world in very similar terms, and in that they are very different from the past 6 or 7 presidents that we've had. Hence, economic liberalization and political decentralization brought about unintended but quite obvious consequences, like the collapse of governing and security structures that in truth no longer worked, but came unhinged nonetheless. And nobody in power has been willing to accept the nature of the change that was unleashed, and that lies, in my view, at the core of the problem. The silver lining, I think, is a growing civil society, even in a cumbersome way. Breaking away from the totalitarian mindset is not easy, but it is happening everywhere in Mexico. Uh, Mexicans, we still have authoritarian reflexes in everything we do. I think all the time, and I see myself sometimes thinking of the way to respond to something, and it is a very knee-jerk reaction that comes from that era and that way of seeing. Nonetheless, civil society is booming for both good and rotten reasons. Let me give you a couple of examples. On the good side, simply because manufacturing, industry, tourism, and agribusiness are thriving, and that creates opportunities for civil society to organize in any number of ways, but also for rotten reasons. There are many communities organizing simply to find their disappeared relatives. There are many communities that are organizing to keep organized crime away from their communities. And there are particular women have been organizing along these lines. The same is true for business organizations that have national presence and that have become leading figures in the fight against crime and corruption. There are organizations working on poor governance, on bad educational results, on impunity, on corruption. Different efforts, all of them decentralized, all of them individual, all of them separate. But I think it's easy to see the complexity of this emerging as a force, particularly because of the mindset that I believe is paramount in Mexico. And nonetheless, the opportunities, I think, are also impressive. The key question in my mind is whether there can be a catalyst. And I go on in the book to analyze what the obstacles are for this happen, from society really organizing in ways that other societies have done so in the past 20 or 30 years. I think that there are many potential triggers, like unpopular decisions or actions. Some could be electoral, some could be, some people thought that the sudden increase, a very steep increase in the prices of gasoline at the beginning of this year could do some of that. In fact, the price of gasoline became a very important issue in the elections of this past Sunday. Nonetheless, I believe the question is what would produce the catalyst for some leadership to emerge that would, one way or another, begin to thread through all these different groupings and bring them together, be them at the local level or at the regional level or eventually at the national level. So another key question is how to unite and organize, to aggregate different sectors and accept diversity in an exercise of tolerance, because many of these organizations could not talk to each other at this moment. What would it take for organizations that think differently but have one common objective or similar objectives to join forces and come together? The catalyst may very well end up being the absence of government, which is really what has created many of these organizations, like in the case of organized crime or the people who have, relatives who have disappeared. So the key at the end of the day is going to be a leadership capable of galvanizing the population to turn a given issue into a true popular movement. This sounds, I think, rightly far-fetched, and I don't, in what I wrote, I don't see that as happening overnight, but I do think that there are some elements of very odd decisions that often governments, local or national, make that could easily trigger something big, particularly if the circumstances are right. So at the end of the day, the question is one of leadership, but I don't think that it's going to come from government. I don't think government is capable of creating the conditions for change to happen. The question today, I think, is who will create that opportunity and what circumstances will make that kind of person or group emerge. So let me read you a quote that appears in the last page of the book, which is by Alexander Herzen, a Russian of the early part of the 20th century. People don't storm the Bastille because history proceeds by zigzags. History proceeds by zigzags because when people have had enough, they storm the Bastille. The question is, where are we in that regard? The Venezuelans have shown that it can take a very long time. Thank you.
Thank you, Luis. As provocative as ever. I'd like to turn the microphone over to Rosana right now. If you could give us your comments, Rosana. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Gracias a todos. Primero y antes que nada, gracias al Instituto México. Thank you for the invitation, and it has been a good board meeting. I see new faces, different faces, which is always good to add up people that are interested in what we're looking at. And I have to thank Luis for his effort in putting out this trilogia, which reminded me of a filmmaker. Some of you know that I like films, and his name is István Szabó. He makes the reference of Mexico being like the Soviet Union. And István Szabó, which is a Hungarian filmmaker, had this wonderful trilogy that talks about the story of the building of the Soviet Union and how Hungary, amongst other countries, were behind the Iron Curtain and how it unfolded. The last one in that trilogy is La Dulce Emma. And it's just about a teacher in a Soviet-controlled high school when she no longer can refer to what was going on her previous paradigm. And the trilogy of Rubio, Una Utopía Mexicana, El Problema del Poder, and now this book, relates us to the transition between la dictadura perfecta y la democracia imperfecta. I read the book in Spanish, and I have a copy of it because I was given an early copy. I don't know about the mischievous images. I have to look at them. I haven't seen them. So I'm going to quote from his book in Spanish from time to time.
That's Duncan's alleged humor.
Let's see. I thought it was something happened with the images that I lost in translation. But in any event, Luis is getting mellower. Nuestro hermano mayor is falling in love with society. I have news for you. He's calling on society. It's with his right to the core. He says that it's time for the society to do their part. Basically, es un "me estás oyendo inútil? Paquita la del barrio" kind of call. So yes, he's talking about the inevitable, the idea that we have to go from a country of monologues to a country of dialogue and tolerance, which is something that does not come naturally to many of us. And he's talking not only about el gobierno esquizofrénico, but the society that is not organized and is not able to work around its future and not even its present. If this were to be a call, I think that I have the acronym for it. La coalición contra el inmovilismo. The coalition against paralysis is what Luis Rubio is calling for. And we have in front of us the possibility of working around not only resolving electoral disputes, which I think we do now, and 24 hours into the Estado de Mexico election, I think that will be resolved eventually, but that does not mean that it will be governable. So in that sense, there's a call that is Luis Rubio's contribution to rethinking our present and our future, which talks about the capacity of dialogue, the capacity of governing, and the capacity to make some fundamental rights available. Those are the capacity to protect the population, the people, the capacity to have checks and balances, which, by the way, becomes so clear that is fundamental when one comes to Washington. And they are there for a purpose and a reason. Checks and balances. And also the capacity to make the property rights and other similar rights available to the population at large. For me, he quoted what I was wanting to quote as well, the quote about La Bastilla. In Spanish, talking about the French and the American traditions that are so prevalent in our culture. In Spanish, we have this saying about que the dog of the hortelán barking, and nobody remembers why the dog started barking. But Armando Fuentes, who's Catón, a great colleague, a great man from Coahuila, says that the important thing is to follow the dog. Whatever he barks about, it doesn't matter. In that sense, we're all waiting for that dog to start barking so that we can follow this idea of La Bastilla being taken when the people are just fed up. And I look forward to that happening sooner rather than later, and having the mellower Luis Rubio being able to spot this society that will be able to take over its own responsibility. So thank you, Luis, for giving us back hope and being more mellow every day.
Thank you very much, Rosana. Carlos.
Thanks, Duncan. I'm also amazed at the prolific production of Luis Rubio, because I think that it's very hard to produce a high-quality book such as the trilogy we're looking at. And he has written 3 books that make us think, which I think is one of the goals he was pursuing. I will comment on 3 issues that come out of the book. The first one is the phrase that Luis himself has already quoted, and it may sound a little weird to some people in the audience, which is the peculiar Mexican way of not governing. The second issue I will comment on is the privilege as a source of impunity. And the third issue that I will comment on is outside scrutiny, how the outside world is watching. So I'll start with the first one. You would think that you want to win an election to govern, to implement your policies, to put in place your view of the world. But more often than not, we find now in Mexico that the objective is not governing, but rather perpetuating a political group in power. Because the use of power, and Luis is very adept at describing it, is precisely that. Serving society has nothing to do. It's just the sheer pleasure of using power for the benefit of your political group, no matter the cost that represents to your country and to society. So it then becomes more important to seize the government rather than what to do with it. Why do you want to win an election? Well, I want to win an election because that guarantees I will have the money, I will wield the power that will allow me to perpetuate my own political group in office, which is exactly what we saw last Sunday in Estado de Mexico, and we'll get back to that. So that breeds a lot of cynicism within society, because the phrase that was once uttered by Felipe Calderón, I don't know if he was the original author of the phrase, el pequeño priista que todos llevamos dentro. Who said that first?
I think Felipe Calderón, no?
See?
Sí, okay.
I mean, I am dismayed to admit that there's some ground to that assertion. And that you look around and you say, I mean, this other guy in the opposition, he wants to get there because he wants to benefit his own group. So right now, I don't see any sense of a collective good in Mexico. And also, Luis describes that in the book. So there may be a world of opportunities, but then again, we have to ask ourselves, opportunities for whom? I'm looking at some statistics from the election in Estado de Mexico, and what I find is rather puzzling. I don't know that the elections court will do anything about it, but Alfredo del Mazo defeated Delfina Gómez, or PRI defeated Morena, basically in 10 out of 45 districts in which the turnout was a total outlier. The statewide average of participation was 52%. But in 10 districts, Alfredo del Mazo got 307,000 more votes than Delfina. And the turnout in those 10 districts was an average of 63%. Anyway, I'm just mentioning that because this will let me go into the second point, that when you are looking at politics in Mexico, you are bound to face a lot of contradictions that, again, Luis describes in detail. And one is the fact that we are extremely concerned about democracy in Venezuela. I am. And I think everybody in this room should be. But at the same time that we're saying to the world we're very concerned about defending democracy, upholding democracy in Venezuela, we steal an election. I mean, the same group that is saying we're extremely concerned about democracy in Venezuela is stealing an election in Estado de Mexico. And I say stealing in spite of the fact that the final results are not out yet and that the PRI candidate has almost 3% advantage, an edge over the next party, because we saw the absolutely cynical, shameless operation, the all-out operation to no matter what, to carry the state. So this state operation to preserve power, not to govern, but to preserve power, takes us to the point that Rosana has highlighted in Luis's book, the role of society. Luis has a very fortunate phrase in which he says, impunity produces abnormal and antisocial behavior. He's absolutely right. Let me name two examples. Since people know that el petróleo es nuestro, oil belongs to Mexicans, and since people look at the upper echelons of Pemex and other political offices, and they say, well, they have helped themselves handsomely, now I'm going to help myself. It's not that I justify anything, a very criminal behavior of whole villages that indulge in sucking the ducts of oil. There's a very Mexican word that used to describe that. I think it wouldn't have a translation, huachicol. But that describes exactly the kind of abnormal behavior that impunity creates. Because they say, how come oil belongs to all of us, but only them can help themselves? In total impunity. So I will help myself as well, because I am better off if I help myself now than if I believe in their promises that they will look after me. They don't care about me. Which brings me to another issue that Luis addresses in a very, very clever way. We, of course, cannot say, and going mellow is a description of what Rosana saw in the book, but I don't think that Luis is sending the message that politicians are evil and bad and society is good and well behaved. He is not at all sending that message. If only because I think that the dialogue within Mexican society is largely a pending task. I mean, this is a dialogue within an elite, and it's fine, but it's very difficult for Mexicans to engage in a dialogue with our own people. Because the segmentation and the polarization and the racial divide and the ethnic divide is so deep that very seldom do we engage in a dialogue with people outside our circle. We don't really know our own people. Somebody was telling me yesterday, if you look at the Mexican delegation here, it could very well be the delegation of a Mediterranean country from Europe. You wouldn't be able to say that it's a mix of Mexico because this dialogue that Luis is urging us to undertake is restricted to our own circle. So I think that Luis points out at a very important challenges. How is this dialogue with ourselves going to take place if we only seldom run into somebody who doesn't belong in our own circle? And this cuts across all the political and economic spectrum. And finally, the outside scrutiny. What we saw again in Estado de Mexico led me to, I guess, to conclude, although it's very risky to conclude anything when it comes to Mexican politics, that our politicians, and I am part of the political class in Mexico, I served in the 57th Congress, and I asked Duncan for the exact translation of the word, son irredentos. Is it irredeemable? Unredeemable. Unredeemable. Thanks, Andrew. No hay manera. O sea, I'm not saying this because I've given up or I'm disenchanted, but I'm saying this because without some sort of external pressure that makes them pay a cost, the effort of Mexican society will not be complete and will not be enough. I'm afraid. This probably I'm challenging one of Luis's theses. But what I've seen is that only when they pay a cost are they pushed to change. In Estado de Mexico, I am absolutely certain that they are sure they will enjoy impunity. So there's no cost. I mean, there's the cost of a lot of angry people, a lot of people that are saying, we were just talking that in the hallway, so much money spent in building Mexican democracy, and what a monumental way to waste it, to make it useless. I mean, anger will give way to some sort of concerted organization, but I think the main dialogue that we have to undertake, I mean, of course it is with the rest of the world, but how we build an objective for the common good of Mexicans. Otherwise, I think we will continue to limp along this line of saying, this whole exercise of politics in Mexico is about helping yourself and nobody else. So my congratulations to Luis. One final thing, he also addresses the everyday justice system, not the big thing, not the big picture, but what happens to you when you go to a public hospital, what happens when you are the beneficiary of a public social development program, all the red tape, all the almost impossibility to get a public official to deliver unless you know the right people, or unless you can reach the price that they will charge you for their services. So this is not a pessimistic comment. This is rather a comment of unless we reckon with the fact that a lot of people in Mexico say those at the top couldn't care less about us, this kind of dialogue will not be complete. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carlos. When you were talking about the need for more dialogue and the fact that our nation is not open to it, you could have easily transferred many of those thoughts to the United States today, which is a sad reading of events. But anyway, Andrew, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Duncan. Thanks for the invitation. And I will be fairly brief because we have an extraordinary audience here, including the chair of the Mexico Institute Advisory Board and really thoughtful people in the audience. Let me, first of all, congratulate Luis for a fun read, a both thought-provoking book, but it's actually enjoyable to read. And I think as Duncan said, it's sort of, there are parts of it that make you want to not laugh out loud quite, but at least they're sort of, he has some ironic references, which are great. I also noticed the mellowing that Rosana talked about, and I noticed it actually before reading the book, because I didn't read the book until last night and this morning, but I had a chance to, reading your column, actually, it was last week or the week before, where you talked about small changes and the importance of small changes and sort of thinking about how, because I think we often talk about sort of maximalist ways of doing things, and in many ways the approach in the book is thinking about a process of change rather than major changes. And we like talking about this in the U.S., and people love talking about this in Mexico, sort of the big thing that's going to actually transform everything, and there are no big answers in the end. And so it is really, the focus of the book really is that sense of how do you get into the virtuous cycle that gets you to where you are. My daughter and my 9-year-old and I are big fans of Hamilton, which we have not gotten tickets to see yet, but we literally listen to some part of the Hamilton score every day, as Rosana knows, and Duncan has been regaled with a bit of this as well. And, one of the central themes of Hamilton, and it is a central theme of the early United States, was the fight between those led by Alexander Hamilton, who really wanted a strong central government, and those led by Thomas Jefferson, James Madison. James Madison kind of played both sides, but eventually James Madison, who really distrusted government, right? Which is a central theme in Luis's book. I mean, this notion, it's something we lived through in this country too. I mean, this notion that early on, we knew we needed a government, but at the same time, having a strong government takes you back to authoritarian times, right? Takes you back to the king, right? In this case, for many people in Mexico, the idea of government is equated with authoritarianism, not just the authoritarianism of a one-party system, but the authoritarianism that people experience today. And this is the huge contrast that Luis talks about in the book. I mean, in some ways, Mexico has changed dramatically in the past 20 or 30 years. I mean, this is a society that, if you look in terms of the business community, I mean, I'm writing a book about how Mexico influences the United States. I mean, there's a business community that is immensely competitive globally, that is investing in the United States and competing with global companies, that even if you look in the micro level, you begin to see entrepreneurship on a very local level that's pretty dynamic. If you look at democracy, I mean, Mexico, democracy does actually matter in Mexico. I mean, there's been a pluralization of ideas in Mexico in the past few ideas. People debate ideas in a very vigorous way, and things do change as a result of that. And so on one hand, you have a society that has, and an economy that has changed and become very open, and on the other hand, a political system that continues to operate much the same way. And Duncan referred to it, I think, as sort of a controlled sort of power-sharing agreement, right? I mean, democracy made the political system expand bit by bit, but it never lost the general contours that it had. So there's this huge public debate about ideas going on, and this huge effervescence in the private sector. And on the other hand, you look at politics, and things are still decided in closed rooms, right? And things are still decided from above. Someone said to me recently, talking to a Mexican business leader who's not here, not involved with anyone in this room, but said to me, you know, in some ways, you still have to be cautious never to offend the president, because there are 1,000 ways that they can send you. You know, they can send inspectors after you, right? Same is true of the governor. But this is true in the business community. It's true in civil society, right? In civil society, if you're working on a cause, you always sort of measure your relationship to power, right? In a way, by the way, that President Trump is discovering does not work in this country, okay, necessarily, right? I mean, that maybe works a little bit, but turns out you don't actually have that much power as president of the United States. Mexico still, if you're president or governor, you know, there's still a power. And this is true if you're in a union. This is true, you know, the politics is controlled, right? It's still very much controlled versus a society that is incredibly vibrant and competitive and open. There are a couple results of this. One is incredible cynicism. I think people are increasingly cynical about public power. You know, when you talk about building the government, the problem is people are cynical about it, right? I mean, in the end, they see it as being something completely different than the ethos they live by in their day-to-day life. And what the response for many people is we want to smash it, right? That may or may not be the right response. I mean, that is, I think, a question that will actually be debated much in the next election in Mexico. You just smash it and start anew, or do you try and reform it from within? But there certainly is a sense of frustration that people, you know, want to either, or people don't vote, right? Or they don't get involved in politics because they see it as something necessarily dirty, inherently dirty in of itself. It also means that, and Luis talks about this, about inequality. You know, the one inequality we can always measure is, you know, the Gini coefficient, and Mexico is a highly unequal country economically. But the bigger inequality is the access to power, right? And going back to Hamilton, it's the room where the room where it happens. If anyone knows the soundtrack, it's a song about being in the room where it happens, where decisions are made.
Who was in the room?
Yes. So who's in the room, right? Yeah. And so who's in the room is sort of this running theme, right? And in many ways, economic activities become more plural, social activities become more plural, but the room where it happens has only slightly gradually increased and continues to be the most unequal part of life in Mexico. Now, it's a question, how do you get from here to there? You know, and I would come back to Luis's column, which is you get there gradually. There is no magic bullet. There is no reform that gets you there. There is no leader that is going to come to power. His last book, he talks about the sort of, it's sort of this very almost veil of ignorance notion. You have this idea of, you know, a leader who would be smart to actually give up power to get power, which I love that concept. If you actually want to be a strong leader of Mexico, your best way of doing it is giving up your discretionality, right? Is giving up your having less discretion, but in return what you get is a stronger government, right? That's not going to happen either, right? It's not going to happen, but it is the road to power, right? I mean, ultimately, what will make people believe in government is that it is less discretional, that people know that decisions are not arbitrary, that decisions are not based on personal whims, on, as Carlos says, sort of maintenance of groups in power, that it's based on impersonal characteristics, right? In the end, what gives us in this country a certain degree of confidence in our government, a certain degree of confidence no matter who is in power, is that it is deeply impersonal. Right? And attempts to make it personal don't always work very well, as it turns out, right? I mean, there is an incredible ability for the government to survive persons on the left and the right of strong personalities and weak personalities, overly active, underly active. I mean, the government continues. It's frustratingly slow sometimes because it's impersonal, but it also gives a certain credibility. Not that the U.S. is necessarily the model for Mexico in any way, but I think where Mexico and what Luis is really talking about in many ways is ultimately building the rules that constrain the arbitrary exercise of power that makes it much more equal. It no longer depends just upon who's in the room where it happens. And that ultimately people begin to have confidence in government, and they want to build that government. Because right now, if you ask people, do you want more government, the answer is usually no, right? People don't want, they want government to stay out of their lives. Right? Just don't, you know, it impedes with economic activity, it impedes with freedom of speech, it just gets in the way, and it's corrupt, it gets in the way. I want to get to the point where people actually embrace government and see it as necessary. But if you dig a little deeper, people want the things that government can give you, right? They don't want too much government, but they want enough of a certainty of the rules, of the order that government can give you, the provision of basic services. And ultimately, I think that's the challenge that Luis is giving us. How do you get to that rule-based society where people really begin to trust in government and then to build a government that matches the needs of the society?
Thank you, Andrew. Andrew, thank you for your comments and for the focus on rules and essentially due process, which Luis mentions, talks about in the book. And that was one of the conversations we had early on in this process. And it came out of a conversation that I'd had with a law professor who every semester talks to his class and says to them, what is the most important amendment to the U.S. Constitution? And he said, it's the 14th Amendment about due process, because that's what guarantees you equal treatment with government. And it's a kind of a unique feature, I think, of the United States system, and one that Mexico would do well to study. Luis, do you have any immediate responses to the comments from your largely friendly reviewers?
You chose them, so.
Politics is controlled, Luis.
I'm very grateful for all your comments. I don't think I've mellowed along the way, but what I did try to do was to rise to the challenge that Duncan posed a year ago, which was what would it take for society to be able to take charge, and I learned many things that I had never thought of along the way. Simply that it's extremely difficult for society to take charge, to grow, or to create the conditions for it to take charge, but it is possible. And the question is how that can happen. And in that sense, it's not. I don't think it's that I mellowed. I think that I went into fields that I didn't know anything about or have not thought about, and that opened new questions and new avenues of opportunity. So I think that I'm much more optimistic of the possibility of change, and I think that is a change in my mindset.
Great, thank you. Let's open this up for comments, questions. Diana.
Thank you very much. Diana Negroponte, right here from Wilson Center. Two short questions, one to Luis, one to Rosana. Luis, you've talked about the strengthening of the PRI, the institution, and yet we are hearing stories about threats to civil society, behavior by central government towards individuals and groups to shut them up. How can you explain? And to Rosana, you've talked about we're waiting for the dogs, but didn't the dogs awake and start barking in September 2015 when the parents of those normalistas in Ayotzinapa begin their campaign?
Thank you, Diana. Do we have another question, please? Dolia. Sorry, Dolia first, then Cindy. Thank you.
Dolia Esteves, I'm a journalist. I have a question that has to do with something that someone very dear to you tweeted a couple days ago, and I'm talking about Enrique Krause. Enrique Krause said that what we need in Mexico next year, it's another French leader like Macron, because the PRI is corrupt, the PAN is inept, and Morena is messianic. And obviously a lot of people are talking about this phenomenon, and they think that it is possible. I would like to see if anyone has an opinion on that. And my second question is, do you think Mexico is ready for a second round, given the elections in the state of Mexico and also the presidential elections? Would that help to consolidate democracy?
Thank you, Dolia. Cindy.
Thanks. Cindy Arnson from the Latin American program here. Luis, I have an idea for your fourth book, which is that we send you on the road to other countries of Latin America, Peru, Argentina, Colombia, perhaps even Chile, and you assess the degree to which the structures of power in Mexico and the lack of democracy and the presence of impunity is different in Mexico than it is elsewhere. We obviously know that, there's a huge problem of organized crime and violence in Mexico that's quite unique. But the questions of, civil society not feeling represented by the government, I mean, these are across the board questions. So I think it would be probably very refreshing to see how Mexico has gone so much further than a lot of other countries in the region in resolving these key questions. And I also sort of have a comment a little bit for Andrew, which is that I think the lesson of this last election is that people don't feel that anybody pays attention to them, that anyone is really listening or taking them into account. And that is the principal explanation for the election of President Trump. And I would also sort of challenge all of us to think about, our roles as elites in the various, sectors that we represent. I think the last time I have been in Anacostia in Southeast Washington was maybe 7 or 8 years ago when I took my kids to the Frederick Douglass Museum. There is a total separation almost in any society based on levels of education, based on income levels more than anything, which is another way of, talking about class. And the final issue is that I think if you were to ask African Americans in this country whether they felt that the justice system or there was a rules-based system in this country that was applied in an even-handed way, you would get a very different response than you get from those of us that sit in institutions like the Wilson Center.
Thank you, Cindy. Luis, why don't you lead us off with the responses?
Well, just a few comments on Diana. The comment I made about President Peña and López Obrador being of the same era is not was not an offhand. I think that they do believe that the government should control society, should be in charge, and the government has been doing that, has been intimidating the organizations from civil society. There are some ironies on your second question to Rosana, and I don't mean to invade her territory, but he claimed that he was in control when he came in because he was the old PRI and the old PRI was coming back. Well, he's the new PRI, I'm sorry. And therefore, he obviously had nothing to do with Ayotzinapa, and nonetheless, he ended up inheriting the problem because he claimed to be in control and in charge. So that's the contrast between the reality of power in Mexico and the pretense that you can control everything. And many of the things that this government has done would have been much more successful had they not pretended to be in control of everything. But you're right, that's the issue. And in the elections of this last Sunday, we saw the practices that we had not seen since the 1980s. There was the three governments after the 1996 electoral reform that was the one that really put forth a competitive electoral system, or at least rules that worked with an institution to supervise them and make professional the process. Cedillo, Fox, and Calderon, they made sure that not a single federal government official would visit any state undergoing elections. There were more than 100 visits of members of the cabinet to the state of Mexico in the last 2 months. I mean, something that is unfathomable. It's incredible to go back to where we were before. On Dolia, I think, I mean, the issue of Macron is an exception in the world, but I think that what I take from that, and it's not Krause that has been calling for it, it's lots of people, it's simply that it was a candidate that was proposing something positive to look forward to, a modern view of the world, not trying to defend the past, and I think that's what everybody's striving for. I don't know who can propose that. There are a couple of the potential candidates that have that kind of stamina, that kind of aura, but whether they would be capable or willing or have the strength to become candidates and therefore presidents is anybody's guess. On a runoff, I think that the real question is what problem we want to address, because Mexicans have a habit of adopting solutions without thinking of what the problem they are trying to address is. So if we wanted better government, and we ended up producing democracy, and we didn't fix the problem of government, and we ended up with a very messy democracy. So I think a runoff, I don't think in Mexico can fix the problem of legitimacy, because 35% of the population doesn't agree with the results, even though we have an impeccable, in my view, an impeccable electoral system. So if we want what the runoff would do, and that were my thoughts in the last couple of months, is what it would fix today is that it would create an opportunity for all the parties to have much more positive messages, to try to build their electorate, to get as many votes for themselves in order to be part of the second, of the runoff of the second round. In that sense, I think if we want to fix the quality of the campaigns, I think that would be settled. If we want to simply address the issue of legitimacy, we won't. And if we want, some other people are claiming that this would improve the quality, this would produce a majority for the party in government, because people would vote in the second round for the same party in the legislature as in government. I think that's baloney. Peña showed that he could buy as many, that the government can buy any votes that he wants in the legislature and pass any legislation that he wants, without a debate of any kind. And that, so the question at the end of the day is, the issue is what problem we want to address. Unless we answer that correctly, we're going to get another messy reform without a solution. And Cynthia, it's a great idea. I think that the complexity of each country is very complex, surely. But I think that Mexico is really very different from Peru or Colombia, and they are more alike, relatively speaking. That reminds me of Tolstoy's the happy families and the unhappy families. But I think that I might as well try to compare with Russia. I think an interesting comparison between a couple of Latin American countries and Russia vis-a-vis Mexico. It would be a fascinating study. Thank you.
Andrew, would you like to respond to the comments about the United States, perhaps? The
U.S. is certainly far from being a perfectly rules-based society. I mean, that said, disadvantaged groups in this country continue to have recourse to the court system, particularly on precedent-setting issues, and we've seen that time and time again. And that's something that begins to happen in Mexico, but it is far from yet being a tradition. On Macron, I actually was thinking the same thing. Just interestingly enough, the sort of radical center, the sort of uncommitted. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. El Bronco. We can. Sometimes there are folks that come out that are not the, ideological independents, but they're kind of these pragmatic independents. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. It'll be interesting to see if it works in France. The idea is wonderful. I mean, these people who are sort of citizen candidates, in practice, it often looks messier than, and I think France is an interesting experience to follow. But we've have a recent experience in Mexico that has perhaps been less felicitous. What? Two.
Fox and Bronco.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, in the different ways. And the second round, I mean, the more it's evident that Mexico is no longer even just a three-way system, but is probably going to continue to be a four-way system in many elections. I don't see how that continues, how, mayors, governors, and you look at this at mayor's level, I mean, this is dramatic, actually, right now. I mean, people winning with 22% of the vote in major cities, right? I mean, that at some point you probably do have to think of a second round in that. I know that's been bubbling up for a while, but just in terms of legitimacy, but also in terms of coalition building, and it alters the tenor of politics. So.
Thank you, Rosana.
Well, Diana, Luis have already answered the Ayotzinapa question, so I'm not going to go there. The only thing that I would like to end my comments with is that you find that Democrats are to be known in victory as well as in defeat. And I think that although I agree that we need some sort of second round, I'm afraid that it would be as costly as it is already if we keep on putting layers, because people do not believe on the results or do not abide by the results or whatever. So I think that at the end of the day, yes, the question is what are we trying to address with putting a segunda vuelta in front of us?
Thank you. Carlos, would you like to chip in here?
Yeah. There's one salient issue that I want to discuss, and that is on Krause's comment that the PRI is corrupt, the PAN is inept, and Morena is messianic. It responds to the Mexican ethos of saying, like the Chapulín Colorado, who can rescue us? Or can we salvage ourselves? I mean, it's a totally different approach. And in our political culture, we were raised believing that somebody can rescue us from ourselves, instead of, putting an emphasis on how we can take responsibility for ourselves. When Jose Antonio Fernandez at FEMSA says the key is how you generate value, he puts the emphasis on the business, the persons. How are you going to generate value? Right now, the emphasis is on how I will control you and will buy your vote, how I will exert pressure on you to exact something from you, how I keep you poor so you will be part of a permanent clientele, rather than saying, how are we going to focus on precisely the title of Luis's book, of generating more opportunities and working alongside producers, housewives, students. How can I work alongside you to help you do better what you're doing? I mean, this may sound idealistic, but I think the crux of the matter, and Luis adeptly points it out, is how do you generate a society in which people can, go beyond survival to say, how am I going to generate value for me, for my family, for my community, rather than saying, how am I going to eventually become a rent seeker and somebody who does not generate value, but rather is looking for a slice of the pie in the old ways of putting me where the money is. That's just that.
Thank you. We have time for another couple of questions, if there are any. Eric, Guadalupe?
Thank you. Maybe there's nothing more to say on Ayotzinapa, but to me it is kind of the most amazing example of the real deep-seated issues that you're talking about. Not the events themselves, the disappearance of the 43, but how the government responded, and how when an international group came and actually showed that the emperor had no clothes, how they reacted to that evidence. I think it's an incredibly powerful image and story about Mexican society and politics and all that. I'd be interested in any further comments you'd want to make on that front. But my question is this. Yesterday in the book presentation with Rod Camp, we talked a bit about the whole Pacto por Mexico issue, and I guess I'd also be interested in your take on that, which was put forward as an example of the triumph, at least momentarily, of pragmatism and coming together and consensus building, something that we in the United States, looking at our own Congress, are actually somewhat envious of. So what does that tell you? Is that an exception that proves the rule? Is that just kind of an outlier that we should all ignore? Or is there something there that could be built upon going forward.
Thank you, Eric. Guadalupe. Microphone coming through, Guadalupe.
Thank you for the comments of everybody. I see like a positive assessment of the situation in Mexico. My assessment is a little bit more negative because of the corruption, of the structural corruption and the endemic corruption that we have in the country. And we didn't mention anything about that. How to solve this problem, because also in the electoral process that took place last weekend, or some days ago, there are allegations of massive fraud, and there is no confidence in the Mexican institutions and in the elections. How can we think about this, and how do we need somebody else look at our processes? I mean, how do we solve this very important problem of endemic corruption in Mexico?
Thank you, Guadalupe. I'm going to throw in one comment of my own here, which is, Luis ends the book on a relatively optimistic note. Even though the title is Violence as a Source of Social Awakening. One of the things that has frustrated me throughout my relationship with Mexico is perfectly summed up by a line from a pop song from the 1980s called Sheep, which was written about British politics. And the line is, apathy is happy that it won without a fight. And one of the things that I found throughout my experience with Mexico is that there are these moments when you think that society is going to get up and will not take any more. And whether it's a march against violence, or whether it is Ayotzinapa, or whether it's an economic crisis, and then apathy takes over again, and things just continue. How do you actually generate social movement that can be sustained? That's, to me, is the critical question. We've seen it in other countries in Latin America. We're seeing it in Brazil right now. How do we actually get society to do that, Luis? Book 4.
Book 4.
That, my friend, the answer is blowing in the wind. I think that it's a critical, it's clearly a critical question. I don't think that can be, I think that it simply happens when it happens, and that's why I like the quote at the end by Herson. When people have had enough, but what's that, and what turns that rage into something else that does not become violent is not an easy thing to resolve or to wish for. I'll leave the Ayotzinapa question to Rosana. On the pacto, it's interesting that when the Peña administration got into government, they won on July 2nd, I think it was, the first Sunday of July, and he assumed office on the 1st of December, which is both the legal dates for election and accession to power. And it was absolutely clear immediately that they had not planned absolutely anything for the government as of then. They planned everything for the inauguration party, but not for government. And only 2 or 3 days before did the PRD propose the idea of the pacto. And it proved to be a winner instantly within the government, because everybody appeared to win as a result. They clearly were able to pass legislation, but if you look at the way, in retrospect, we are all very smart in retrospect, but what really happened was that these were agreements among the leaders of the parties with the government to set first an agenda and then the content of the piece of legislation, and all but part of the energy bill were subscribed by the 3 big parties with the government, and then they were passed in the Congress literally without any discussion or any debate of any kind. So it was not only a big room, it was a fairly small room that these conversations took place in. There was no democratic check on anything, and there were there was lots of money crossing hands for the parties and for the members of the vote. There were some votes that were incredibly costly, incredibly, I mean, in the zillions. So what it ended up doing was corrupting PAN and PRD that up to then had, at least as parties, not as individuals, but as parties, had kept the image of more honest, at least, than pre. And the result is that the three parties ended up being in the doldrums politically. So I don't think that that's an example for anything. Nobody quotes the pact as a system for solving problems in the future anymore. I don't think corruption is the main problem. I think corruption is a symptom of a system with a lack of rules, a lack of a governing structure that works and that is accountable to the people, or at least that there are consequences for their actions. So corruption becomes a system in itself, and it takes a life of its own. So I don't dispute the importance of corruption. I'm simply saying that it's a consequence. It's not a cause. They've developed an incredibly ridiculous, in my view, answer to the issue of corruption, which the national system of anti-corruption. Why not better eliminate the causes of corruption than go against the corrupt? I learned a lot when the Mexican economy was begun to be liberalized in the late 1980s. The Ministry of the Economy, what is called the economy today, it was industry and economy then, went from orders of magnitude from some 17 or 18,000 people working there to some 3,000. And the reason that they did that was that all those paper pushers, people who were bought to make their paper on the top of the pile, or the paper of their competitors not to get there, for permits, for imports, for exports, for investment, for whatever, all those requirements were eliminated, and therefore all the corruption that roamed around that building simply vanished. Period. Because the government no longer had the power to grant those permits, and therefore their responsibility was to regulate rather than to issue permits. For me, that was a learning experience, and I think that's what has to be addressed. Eliminate, as Andrew said, all that enormous discretion that borders in arbitrariness, and the government becomes much more efficient and certainly much less corrupt. There's corruption everywhere, not only in government certainly, but it's the way of it's the rules that grant so much power to decision makers that make it possible for this to happen. Granting contracts without transparency is one of the prime ways in which the government operates. That power could be very different. In the U.S., regulatory entities have enormous power, but they are not arbitrary. And the difference between discretion and arbitrary power is everything.
Well, I was not, maybe I was not as clear as the book is about corruption, because the book talks about corruption. Luis has just mentioned it. I was trying to stress the difference in his approach. And there's this novel that I like called The God of Small Things.
Yes.
And I was trying to stress that he was, in my view, he doesn't like that I use the word mellow, but he was
I don't object.
being more optimistic about. So I was discussing what has changed in Luis's approach, in my view. So because of being trained as a journalist, being a recovering journalist, I tend to write about what is new rather than what is not new. What is not new is what he referred to in view of what you're asking, Eric, about Ayotzinapa. And he has stressed time and again that we're back in the 70s with AMLO and Peña Nieto, back in the 70s. And just for the record, I don't think that AMLO is Chavez's, but he's very much like Echeverria in many senses. So talking about Guerrero, talking about a rural normal, and the mix of that those unfortunate events, and the way that the government reacted to the investigation around them, combined with your opioid epidemic, is something that we need to look very much jointly as to what tells about our own hypocrisy as a country and yours.
Thank you. Carlos, do you have any closing remarks?
Yeah. On Eric's question, the pacto, basically, I mean, Luis explained the whole process, but I think the main limitation, and at that point in time, I wrote a piece for the Christian Science Monitor saying it's news that we're looking for a consensus, but it stopped at the upper echelons of the political class. I mean, it wasn't even implemented with the legislators. So I am afraid that we're making the same mistake. Those in charge are making the same mistake for the NAFTA renegotiation. I mean, they are approaching it as if we were in the same political situation of 1991, 1992. There's, like we discussed this morning, there's no generation of any constituency, no basis of support, no conscience of people how that supposedly would benefit the majority of the population. It's just, from the top to the bottom saying this is going to be good for you because we know what's good for you. And that's what happened with the pacto. It was just the upper echelons of the political parties saying we've struck a deal. When I asked our Secretario de Hacienda, not this one but the previous one, what do you need to pass the budget? He said, just the votes. Are you sure just the votes? I mean, you don't need to do any persuasion. You don't need to do, no, I just need the votes. So if you approach that in the same fashion, you're going to get the same results.
Thank you, Carlos. Carlos, Rosana, Andrew, thank you very, very much for being here with us. Luis, always a great pleasure. Look forward to the next discussion we're going to have about what happens next. Thank you for being such a great contributor to our work. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Sí, pero tengo que ir por mi maleta.